Why is Roundup in 87% of American children? I live in the country. I'm driving down the street. I look over into the field. There's a man with a full hazmat suit, gloves, respirator, head-to-toe protection, and he's spraying something on the crops. That chemical, which we're going to talk about, ends up in the bread, cereal, oatmeal, baby food, beer, wine, and the CDC has actually tested the urine of children and found something startling. 87% of these kids tested positive for it in their urine. 80% of adults tested positive for it. We're talking about the chemical called glyphosate. The World Health Organization says it probably causes cancer. What does that definition of probably mean? Well, it means likely, but there's conflicting information because the EPA said it's safe. Don't quote me on the time frame, but it was at least 3 years ago. The federal court looked at the EPA's work. And unfortunately right now, the government is trying to make sure that you can never sue over that. Roundup Ready has been around since 1974. For 20 years, farmers and landscapers used it to kill weeds. Then in 1994, everything changed. Companies introduced something called genetically modified crops, engineered to survive being drenched with this Roundup herbicide. Over 200 million pounds of Roundup is currently being sprayed over American farmland. But here's what people don't know. Roundup is not just sprayed on the crops growing. It's also sprayed on wheat, oats, barley, right before they harvest it as a drying agent. So the highest chemical residue is on the food that's about to go into your kitchen. The CDC tested over 2,000 Americans. And like I said before, they found glyphosate in 80% of adults. And these levels in human urine has gone up since 1974 by a factor of 500%. Now, let's get back to the EPA. They said it's not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. Okay, that's their official position. But the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Agency looked at the same science and classified it as a probable carcinogen. It's really bizarre because you have two of the most scientific bodies on planet Earth, same data, opposite conclusions. So, who is telling the truth? There was a federal court that looked into this and actually answered that question, and I want to explain what they found. In 2022, this federal court looked at the EPA's safety determination on glyphosate, and they didn't just disagree with it, they actually threw it out. The court said it was not supported by substantial evidence. The EPA's own scientists wrote their own cancer review that they could reach no conclusion about whether glyphosate causes the specific cancer that's tied to Roundup. Then in the same document, the EPA stamped out the whole thing as not likely to cause cancer. Now here's the problem. You can't say that we don't know. And then in the same document say, but overall it's fine, because both of those viewpoints conflict. The EPA actually has a rule book for evaluating cancer research. They wrote these rules themselves. So there's animal studies that show that glyphosate causes tumors, okay? But the EPA basically threw those out. They didn't use them. And so in the court's own words, they said the EPA's conclusions were divorced from its own guidelines. The court called it disregard of tumor results. But don't worry, it gets worse. Nobody sprays pure glyphosate. People spray Roundup, which is glyphosate and other chemicals. And the research shows that the formulation of all the chemicals combined is more toxic than glyphosate alone. And the EPA was well aware of this. And millions of farmers get Roundup on their skin every single day. Skin contact is the main route of exposure. But the EPA never measured how much gets into the bloodstream through the skin. They skipped that very important piece of the puzzle. The court used words like arbitrary, which means it's based on opinion, not by fact, and also inconsistent reasoning. But regardless, they threw the whole review out and told the EPA to redo it. That was in 2022. It's 2026 right now. Still no cancer warning, and we're still being exposed to it. For that information, it helps to understand the people running the review that used to work for the company that they're reviewing. There's a man by the name of Jess Rowland. Okay, he was a deputy division director at EPA's Office of Pesticide Programs. Rowland told Monsanto's regulatory affair manager about blocking a separate agency's glyphosate investigation. And then in a separate email, Rowland would be retiring from the EPA soon and could be useful as we move forward with ongoing glyphosate defense. After leaving the EPA, Rowland became a consultant for the Associates of Monsanto. And then we have Marianne Copley, okay, 30-year EPA toxicologist. dying of breast cancer. She wrote Roland a letter in 2013 listing 14 mechanisms by which glyphosate causes tumors and stating it is essentially certain that glyphosate causes cancer. Her dying words to him were, for once, do the right thing and don't make the decision based on how it affects your bonus. Unfortunately, she died in January 2014. Roland ignored every word and continued chairing the committee that cleared glyphosate. Then we have Linda Fisher, worked as an EPA administrator for pesticides and toxic substances. She moved to Monsanto as vice president of governmental affairs to lobby on their behalf, then went back to the EPA as deputy administrator. Then we have Mary Manny-Busson, former EPA toxicologist. When Monsanto needed help blocking another agency's glyphosate review, they text her. She replied, "Sweetheart, I know lots of people. You can count on me." Then she later returned to the EPA as division director. Court documents also revealed Monsanto employees drafted safety studies that were published under names of supposedly independent researchers. A key 2000 study frequently cited as evidence of glyphosate's safety was substantially written by Monsanto scientists. One internal email discussed how to ghostwrite certain sections of that document. Then we get to Michael Taylor, Monsanto attorney who left for the FDA, where the agency created a new position for him, Deputy Commissioner of Policy, who then became the FDA official with the most influence on GM, genetically modified food regulation. Then went back to Monsanto as VP of Public Policy, then returned to FDA again as senior advisor to the commissioner. These people who are supposed to protect you are working for the company selling you the product. But here's the part that changes everything, because cancer isn't the only problem. For decades, safety arguments were simple. Glyphosate killed plants by blocking a certain pathway that humans don't have. It's called the Shikimate Pathway. So they say, well, it's safe because humans don't have that pathway. But here's what they left out. Your gut bacteria do have that pathway. So here we have trillions of microorganisms that run your immune system, that make your neurotransmitters, that protect your gut lining, that help you make vitamins, that help control inflammation, all vulnerable to this chemical. Especially the lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium. These are the two categories of microbes that really protect you against the pathogens. And what's really wild about this whole thing is the pathogenic bacteria, the ones that cause disease, tend to be resistant to glyphosate. And what's really bizarre is one of the patents for glyphosate is the application of using it as an antibiotic. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma, the cancer that is most tied to Roundup, rose 90% in the United States between 1950 and 1999. Today, 80,000 Americans are diagnosed with it every single year. Bayer, the company that bought Monsanto, paid out over $11 billion in Roundup cancer settlements. And then in 2023, Bayer quietly pulled glyphosate out of the home version of Roundup. But here's the part that no one's talking about. What did they replace it with? The new home Roundup products contained 4 replacement ingredients. Diquat dibromide, Fluazifop-P-butyl Triclopyr, and imazapyr are in all the new formulations. This chemical is 200 times more chronically toxic than glyphosate. It is classified as a highly hazardous pesticide. It is banned in the European Union and China. And they have found this new formulation 45 times more toxic to human health. Also more toxic to bees, birds, fish, and earthworms. More likely to leach out in the groundwater. Damages the intestines, kills beneficial gut bacteria, interferes with nutrient absorption, and triggers chronic inflammation. The packaging is nearly identical to the old version, but there's no language alerting consumers to the higher risks. So what can you do about this? Well, number one, I would highly recommend you buy organic as much as possible. Especially if you eat wheat, I highly recommend you eat it organic. Organic certifications ban glyphosate. And if you can't fully go organic, start with your kids' breakfast cereal and oats product. Just feed them eggs and bacon. Another thing that's really important to do is start building up your gut microbiome with fermented foods like kefir, sauerkraut. Start feeding the bacteria that the glyphosate is killing. I highly also recommend you test your urine to see what your levels of glyphosate are. I'm going to put a link down below of a company that will do that for you. This video is about awareness because if you don't know about certain things, how can you control it?